Welcome, viewers and listeners. Have a pleasant day, each and everyone. Today, I'll be discussing institutional corrections. But before anything else, sit back and relax. In a few minutes, I'll be back. Lesson 1. Discuss the global view on prison antiquity to modernity, the influence of the Roman Catholic Church, Pope John Paul, the Profile Pope, Walnut Street Jail, King Henry VIII, and King Edward VI, a jewel of King Henry VIII. As named institutional corrections, it comes in our mind about jail, prison, and provincial jail. Under the old curriculum, if we talk institutional corrections, we are talking about keeping and so-called rehabilitation. Rehabilitation focuses on development of inmate, but we will not use the word inmate anymore. We called it person of deprived of liberty or PDL. So, institutional correction, definition of terms commonly used in the correctional study. First is the prison. Second is competent authority. Third is inmate. Fourth is detainee. Fifth is death convict. Sixth is carpeta. And the last is prison record. So we will not discuss individually the definition of terms about a correctional, but let's proceed to another. So let's discuss first the history of corrections. Important personalities. William Penn, he is an American. He included in the legislation from Pennsylvania that imprisonment shall be the prescribed of punishment for criminals, that all prisons shall be workhouse for felons, vagrants, and idle persons, and that each country shall build one. The colony of the New Plymouth provided for the erection of the house for the confinement. Workhouse is a building where very poor people in Britain used to work in the past in exchange for food and shelter. A felony is typically defined as a crime punishable by a term of imprisonment of 1 year or more. So William Penn is famous for founding Pennsylvania Corrections. The Pennsylvania Department of Corrections is responsible for operating the state prison system and provides parole supervision of re-entrants. He advocated religious freedom and fought for the abolition of death penalty as a form of punishment. In the U.S., in the late 17th and early 18th century, William Penn's experiment included experiments in criminal justice. In Pennsylvania, the death penalty was abolished for all crimes except premeditated murder. The question is, does Pennsylvania support the death penalty? So today, Pennsylvania has the fifth largest death row among all states that allow the death penalty. But it has declined rapidly in the past 2 decades. In the early 2015, Governor Tom Wolf announced he was placing a moratorium on executions due to the concerns surrounding innocence and racial bias. The development of prisons. William Penn's Code for Prison was adopted, and a group of Quakers formed the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons. The Quakers adopt William's Code for the good of each prisoners. The aim of the society was to bring some degree of humane and orderly treatment to growing penal system. An honorary degree awarded to those who have distinguished themselves through humanitarian and philanthropic contributions to the society. So the only models of custodial institutions at that time were the local country jails that Penn had established. So William Penn also gave emphasis about the local jail. During the 10th century in England, prisons used to detain debtors, unemployed, or those awaiting trial. 12th century in England, country jails were constructed to hold thieves and vagrants before the disposition of their sentence. Under the leadership of Henry II in 12th century and King John in 13th century, prisons in England started implementing strict law which told that no person can incarcerated without fair trial, During that time, the famous Tower of London started holding the first of its prisoners. At the year 1301, Lee staged prison in Italy. Punishment was incarceration, separate cells, segregated by the age, gender, mental state, and serious of the crime. At this time, inside the jail, the people are segregated accordingly because the officers are know and aware of what might be happen if they will not segregate the prisoners. We all know that the people have different attitude and different colors and whatsoever. So to avoid any crime inside the jail, police officers arrange and give action. At the year 1557, the Brideswell Workhouse was built to hold those convicted of relatively minor offenses. Serious offenders were held there pending execution. People also ask, what were prisons like in the 70s in England? So prisons at this time were often in old buildings, such as castle. They tended to be damp, unhealthy, insanitary, and overcrowded. All kinds of prisoners were mixed into together as a cold bath feeds men, women, children, the insane, serious criminals, and petty criminals, and people awaiting trial and debtors. Year 1780s, English household prisoners on hulks. So prisoners were kept herded into awful cells with no heating, no bedding, and no sanitation, running water and toilet facilities. It didn't matter what the criminal had done or whether they were awaiting trial. Everyone was treated the same. It was hard in jail. Incarceration did not become the norm until 19th century. The origin of corrections in the United States. The modern American correctional system actually started in Pennsylvania under the leadership of William Penn. Early 17th century, the first American jail was built in James City, Virginia. At the year 1773, Newgate Prison opened in Connecticut. Today, in 1773, Newgate Prison, the first penal institution to open in Connecticut, received its very first prisoner, 20-year-old John Henson, who had been convicted of burglary and sentenced to 10 years of imprisonment. At the year 1775, Castle Island Prison opened Massachusetts. After the Revolution, Massachusetts state forces garrisoned Castle Island. And in 1785, the Commonwealth also used the island as a state prison. So next is the Aborn system. First is the tier system. Tier refers to a series of rows or layers or a level or grade in the hierarchy of an organization or system. Second is the congregate system, was another name for the Aborn system, which was a philosophy of penitentiary management where inmates worked in silence during the day and were in solitary confinement at night. Next is the philosophy of the Aborn prison system, was crime prevention through fear of punishment and silent confinement. Next is the silence and solitude was seen as key, and regimentation became a standard mode of prison life, and inmates congregate for eating and for work. Prisons of the 20th century, time of contrast in the U.S. prison system, advocate of reform, rehabilitation, education, and religion. Development of specialized prisons are industrial prison for hardcore inmates, agricultural prison and non-dangerous offenders, and lastly is institutions for criminally insane. Prison industry evolved. Contemporary correctional institutions during 1960s, 1970s, prisoners' right movement, prisons riots, the medical model emerged at the year. At the year 1980s, inmate violence and gangs emerged, control of inmates essential, incapacitation, and punishment rather than rehabilitate. During 1980s, people inside jail has a group, and other word, if you don't have a group and you will disobey them, they will might kill you or you will be in trouble. In jail, they have a leader, so the riots are there. So today, attempts to improve prison conditions, tighten discipline, build new super maximum security prisons, to house, and last is prison overcrowding has stalled improvement attempts. If we will talk about the European background, historically, institutional confinement has been used since ancient times, but not until the 60s and 70s as a major punishment for criminals. Prior to that, it was used to detain people before trial, hold prisoners awaiting other sanctions, coerce payment of debts and fines, hold and punish slaves, achieve religious indoctrination, the Inquisition. Next is the forerunners of modern incarceration. Modern incarceration strives to change the offender's character and is carried out away from public view. At the early punishments for crime were directed more at the offender's body and property. Goals were to inflict pain, humiliate the offenders, and detect onlookers for crime. The two additional forerunners of modern incarceration were first is banishment and second is transportation. So we will discuss first the banishment. Banishment is a punishment originating in ancient times that required offenders to leave the community and live elsewhere community in the wilderness. So what is the purpose of banishment? The purpose is to ensure that a criminal will be removed from his family and doomed to wander the wilderness. Second is the transportation is a punishment in which offenders were transported from their home nation to one of that nation's colonies to work. So what is the difference between the two? So banishment in ancient Greece ranged from complete exile to avoid retaliation to a 10-year exile for political prisoners, while transportation in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries was practiced by many countries. They were characterized by inhumane conditions and exploitation of the prisoners as slaves. The closest European forerunners of modern U.S. prisons were known as workhouses. From the word workhouses, it means a house of correction for persons guilty of minor law violations. So workhouses in European forerunners of the modern U.S. prison where offenders were sent to learn discipline and regular work habits. Next is the development in the United States. In colonial American, penal practices was loose, decentralized, and unsystematic, combining private retaliation with fines, banishment, harsh corporal punishments, and capital punishment. So the penitentiary movement, the Walnut Street Prison was a pioneering effort in prison reform. Originally built as a conventional jail just before the American Revolution, it was expanded in 1790 and hailed as a model of enlightened thinking about criminals. The prison was built on Walnut Street in Philadelphia as a city jail in 1773 to alleviate overcrowding in the existing city jail. Although designed by Robert Smith, Pennsylvania's most prominent architect, the building was a typical U-shaped building, designed to hold groups of prisoners in large rooms. The prison, in fact, was known as penitentiary, from the Latin word for remorse. It was designed to provide a severe environment that left inmates much time for reflection, but it was also designed to be cleaner and safer than past prisons. The Walnut Street Prison was one of the forerunners of an entire school. The prison, in fact, was known as penitentiary, from the Latin word again, remorse. So it was provide a severe environment that left inmates of a true on a prison, construction and reform. Prisons were overcrowded and dirty, and inmates attacked each other regularly. Those who served their sentences came out of prison, probably more inclined towards a criminal life than they were before their incarceration. But the main addition to the Walnut Street complex was a new cell block called the penitentiary, so no one can escape. So the prison inmate characteristics are the 90% of prisoners in the US are in the state prisons and 10% are in the federal prisons. So if we will talk about their characteristics, the largest proportion of state prisoners are the male. Minority have not completed high school, under age 35, and had never married. So a lot of men commit a crime because they are strong like women. So the prison population is characterized as follows: about 50% serving sentences for violent offenses, about 20% for property offenses, about 20% for drugs offenses, the remainder for public order offenses. So as you can see, the 50% are the sentences for violent offenses. So in other word, they commit a crime, and a crime that is so violent, while 20% is the property offenses, like the property they have some issues or what, and the 20% is those people who talk drugs like that. So next is the men's prisons. Men's prisons, the most common general type of prison, are both distinguished by security level. Security level, a designation applied to a facility to describe the measures taken both inside and outside to preserve security and custody. So the simplest security level categorization is maximum, medium, and minimum. So maximum security facilities are characterized by very tight internal and external security. So as you can see the pictures, no space anymore. There are so many prisons, like others can sleep well, so they are just standing, sitting, just to relax, but they can't really relax. So the common security measures include a high wall or razor wire fencing, armed guard towers, electronic detectors, external armed patrol, a wide open buffer zone between the outer wall or fence and the community. Why? It is because if they will not make a high wall or razor wire fencing and the other measures to secure the prisoners, some will escape. Not some, but others will escape. So we will proceed to the women's prison. Women make up about 7% of the prison population, but the incarceration rate for the women has grown faster than the incarceration rate for women. So if we will talk about that, as we know that men are strong and they have the ability to commit crime or what they think is right, they will do that. So while the women, they are weak, and also we are not so many women than the boys. There is so a lot of populations about men. So a greater proportion of women than men are serving sentences for property offenses. Women are more likely to have dependent children and to be serving their first prison term. So women's prisons exclusively for women tend to be smaller and house fewer inmates than institutions exclusively for men. So dorm and cottage plans are much more common than cell block plans for women's prisons. So the women, they are arranged properly by what case or what crime they commit, and the difference between the men and the women is that the cell block of the women is that not so high with other women, with other men, because men are so strong, as what I said. Then they are smart also. If they want to escape, and they can. So jails and lockups. So suspect usually stay in a lockup for only 24 to 48 hours. A suspect may later be transferred from the lockup to the jail. So in practice, a jail serves as a catch-all function in criminal justice and corrections. A jail may hold convicted offenders serving short sentences, convicted offenders awaiting transfer to prison, offenders who have been violated their probation or parole, defendants who are awaiting trial. So the prison services next is many of the human services and programs found in the free society are duplicated within prisons. So prisoners are served well. They give food services, building maintenance and repair, medical and dental services, mail and phone services. Prisoners also has the rights. That's why they have their services. They also have visitations, commissionaries where prisoners can purchase food, tobacco, wages, and reading materials. But for about the commissaries, so we will just not include the poor because we know that poor can't have a business like that. So next is the recreational facilities, like legal resources, religious services. So all in the prisoners have a right to visit with the priest. Priest will help them to enlighten their way, their life. So religious services is there. So all institutions have special needs. Population in particular, like elderly inmates who require more medical attention, inmates with mental disorders, inmates with HIV and AIDS. So there are many services that's offered for the prisoners so that they will be also safe and sound. And also, it has long been assumed that rehabilitation can be facilitated by improving inmates' academic skills and providing them with job skills. So much prison education amounts to remedial schooling designed to prepare inmates to obtain their GEDs. So their education is also there. There is also a person who will teach them so that their knowledge will still be there. Some prison vocational programs operate as a part of job assignment, others and separate. Either way, the goal is to provide inmates with job skills that will provide their marketability upon release. And also the services that prison will serve them is the counseling and therapy offered in prisons varies widely. Sometimes individual counseling, one-on-one with a counselor, and group counseling are both offered. So there are a lot of services offered in prison. So notes to remember, let's not forget about the Presidential Decree number 1257, amending certain sections of Presidential Decree numbered 968, otherwise known as the Probation Law of 1976, whereas the need to strengthen certain provisions of the Presidential Decree number. Next is the Presidential Decree number 76, classifies real property for purposes of the real property tax into commercial, industrial, mineral, agricultural, and residential. Whereas there are other kinds of real property such as educational, cultural, scientific, recreational, and so forth, which by their nature and use do not fall squarely under any of the above mentioned classifications, and whereas the latter should be considered as special classes with corresponding assessment levels. Next is by the Presidential of the Philippines, Executive Order number 292, instituting the Administrative Code of 1987, whereas the Administrative Code currently in force was first forged in 1917 when the relationship between the people and the government was defined by the colonial order then prevailing, whereas efforts to achieve an integrative and overall recodification of its provisions resulted in the Administrative Code of 1978, which, however, was never published and later expressly repealed. Let's proceed to parole. Parole is an option person becomes eligible after the minimum number of years served. It means indeterminate sentence. This is not right but privilege. A parole board looks at inmates' history, criminal offenses, and behavior. So, the release of a prisoner temporarily for a special purpose or permanently before the completion of a sentence on the promise of good behavior. Inmate is serving undeterminate sentence, the maximum period of which exceeds 1 year. Inmate has served the minimum period of the indeterminate sentence. Next is punishment. Primeval sense is infliction of some sort of pain on the offender for violating the law. Legal sense, it refers to individual redress or personal revenge. Therefore, it is defined as the system of redress that the state takes against the offending member. So these are the early forms of punishment before. If you commit a grave mistake, so there's a possibility that they will do the death penalty. So as you see the photo, that's their forms of punishment before. Punishment and penalty. From the word punishment, inflict a penalty or sanction on someone as retribution for an offense, especially at transgression of legal or moral code. Penalty is a punishment imposed for breaking a law, rule, or contract. So next is justification for punishment. First is retribution, the act of taking revenge. Retribution is defined as something done to get back at someone or the act of punishing someone for their actions. An example of retribution is when someone gets the death penalty for committing murder. Second is expiation or atonement, means reparation for offense or injury. Atonement is to attain forgiveness for some sin or transgression. Atone for betraying my friend. It is something that you do. Expiation means to clear away the record to make it as if it never existed. The idea of the atonement stretches across all religions from Judaism, Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, perhaps the most famous example of expiation, the Christian doctrine of Christ dying to absolve the world's sins. So the next philosopher is the one who invented the panopticon. It's Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham is an English philosopher and social terrorist in the mid-70s. So Bentham believed that any person or group who carried out acts that were detrimental to society should be punished with imprisonment. So Jeremy Bentham was also famous for the prison design known as panopticon. So why Jeremy Bentham made the panopticon? The basic principle for the design, which Bentham first completed in 1785, was to monitor the maximum number of prisoners with the fewest possible guards and other security costs. So panopticon is a type of institutional building and a system of control. So Jeremy Bentham, greatest leader in the reform of English criminal law. So next philosopher is Francois Marie Arouet, a French author and a philosopher who believed that fear of a shame is a deterrent to crime. In the year 1716, Voltaire was exiled to Toul for mocking the Duc d'Orléans. In 1717, he returned to Paris only to be arrested and exiled to the Bastille for a year on charges of writing libellous poetry. Voltaire was sent to the Bastille again in 1726 for arguing with the Chevalier de Rohan. As the picture shown, that is the La Bastille of the Paris at the year 1790. So Francois Marie Arouet, known as Voltaire, was a writer, philosopher, poet, dramatist, historian, and polemicist of the French-English Enlightenment. Francois Marie Arouet, 1694-1778, known as Voltaire, was a writer, philosopher, poet, dramatist, historian, and polemicist of the French Enlightenment. He was imprisoned in the Bastille for nearly a year. So next is John Howard. Was a philanthropist and early English prison reformer. John Howard is called as a father of prison reform. He would eventually spend the rest of his life and considerable amounts of money on efforts for prison reform and improvement of the lives of prisoners both within the United Kingdom and other countries in Europe. His exemplary efforts in living for the sake of others are remembered and honored in several are organizations bearing his name that continue to work for penal reform. John Howard was appointed High Sheriff of Bedfordshire in 1773. What did John Howard do in prisons? He advocated a system of state-controlled prisons in which the regime was taut but the environment healthy. In 1779, the Penitentiary Act authorized the construction of two prisons in accordance with his own theories. He advocated a regime of solitary confinement, hard labor, and religious instruction. In the year 1777, by his work State of Prisons, Parliament passed the Penitentiary Act, providing four principles for reform. First is secure a sanitary structure. Second is systematic inspection. Third is abolition of fees. Fourth is a reformatory regime. He pioneered the concept of penitentiary and devoted his life and fortune to prison reform while serving as sheriff of Bedfordshire. So utilitarianism, a principle introduced by Jeremy Bentham, claiming that individuals put every situation into equation to determine the pleasure from the commission of a crime and pain that will sustain be as a consequence. Law should be used to inflict enough pain to offenders for them to cease from committing crime. Example of is when individuals are deciding what to do for themselves alone, they consider only their own utility. For example, if you are choosing ice cream for yourself, the utilitarian view is that you should choose the flavor that will give you the most pleasure. So next philosopher is Sir Samuel Romilly, a follower of Bentham who pressed for the construction of the first modern English prison, the Milkbank Prison in 1816. English legal reformer whose chief efforts were devoted to lessening the severity of English criminal law. Romilly became known as the outstanding chancery lawyer in England and served as Chancellor of Durham from 1805 to 1815. In 1806, he was appointed Solicitor General, entered the House of Commons, and was knighted. His program for the mitigation of punishment in criminal law was based in part on the criminology of Caesar Beccaria and the utilitarian philosophy of Jeremy Bentham. He is well remembered for his treatise on crimes and punishments. So next is Denis Diderot or Denis Diderot, a French encyclopedic and philosopher whose encyclopedia became a force for change in the 18th century. Like Montesquieu and Voltaire, he was also imprisoned from denouncing orthodox religion in his work, Letters from the Blind. Now and again, he was more direct as in this essay on political authority, in which he defended the idea of consent of the governed, a basic demand of Democrats, as well as denouncing the idea that might makes right. He thought that most European governments had acquired their power by means of violence. Next is Cesar Bonesana Marchis de Beccaria, was a founder of the classical school of criminology. As a Milanese lawyer, published short treatises on crimes and punishments. At the age of 26, it was the most exciting essay on the law of 18th century. Jeremy Bentham devised the Panopticon Inspection House. So next philosopher is Jean-Jacques Villain. In 1773, he built the Maison de Fosse, Strong House. He is one of the first who developed the system of classification of inmates. He defined discipline by the biblical rule, if any man will not work, neither let him eat. What is the story behind Alcatraz? The name Alcatraz is derived from the Spanish Alcatraces. In 1775, the Spanish explorer Juan Manuel de Ayala was the first to sail into what is now known as San Francisco Bay. His expedition mapped the bay and named one of the three islands Alcatrazes. Over time, the name was anglicized to Alcatraz. The United States Department of Justice acquired the United States Disciplinary Barracks Pacific Branch on Alcatraz on 12 October 1933. The island became adopted and used as prison of the Federal Bureau of Prisons in August 1934. After the buildings were modernized and security increased, after being closed in 1963 as a prison of Alcatraz has been reopened as a public museum. It is one of the San Francisco's major tourist attractions, attracting some 1.5 million visitors annually. Now operated by the National Park Service's Golden Gate National Recreation Area. The former prison is being restored and maintained. As you see the difference of Alcatraz before and Alcatraz today, they are different. That is the Alcatraz today. In 1972, Congress created the Golden Gate National Recreation Area and Alcatraz Island was included as part of the new National Park Service unit. The island opened to the public in the fall of 1973 and has become one of the most popular Park Service sites. More than 1 million visitors from around the world visit the island each year. So in the Alcatraz, no one can escape because it is the center of the ocean. And if ever you will escape, there's no way to escape. And there is one very smart prisoner who escaped that time because he's so smart. So, in conclusion, institutional corrections and their efficiency is the topic that extremely interests me. Nowadays, the institutional corrections are enhanced by various technologies that improve the metal detection capability, management of the internet access among the inmates, and various devices that help officers ensure that no illegal action will take place, like x-rays to identify any contraband, cameras that capture movement in the zones where no movement is allowed, and many more. So at the same time, such use the sensitive technology leads to the technology dependence in jails and prisons, which can significantly complicate the work of officers. So that's all. Thank you for listening. Have a pleasant day, everyone.